Welcome. It's good to see you this way, though I had hoped to see you a different way, especially after last year in person. But it's exciting that you're here, and I know that I'll get to welcome a lot of you in person later. Welcome to today's diversity presentation. My name is Alexander Byrd. I'm an associate professor of history. I'm also vice provost for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I teach the introduction to African and African American studies here at Rice. And in the history department, I generally teach African and African American history, particularly the slave trade, and a couple of courses on Jim Crow America. But I'm here today to get the diversity presentation kicked off. And I'm showing here behind me on the slide L'Ouverture by Lyle Ashton Harris, which I'm not going to tell you much about today. But if you stop me on the street, I'll tell you why I thought it was important to start with this. In addition to the roles that I just indicated to you, I also serve with Caleb McDaniel, who's also in the history department, as the co-chair for the Task Force on Slavery, Segregation, and Racial Injustice, which also has some bearing on my remarks today. And I'll be drawing from some of our work on that task force as I speak to you. If I were to give this talk a title, the title would be the 5. Be the 5. Don't be the 14. That's the title, I think, of the talk. And it comes from the Rice Thresher. From an edition that came out long before you were born, long before I was born, long before my mother was born. It came out in the days of my grandparents and great-grandparents. It's an article that came out on Friday, November 16th of 1928. And I have about 10 minutes with you today. What I said before doesn't count in that 10 minutes. What I say moving forward does. And I have about 10 minutes with you today, and I'm going to spend most of that time on this piece from the 1928 Rice Thresher. And the title of the article in this Thresher is Wild Scenes at Pre-Law Banquet. Fake Letter Perpetrates Hoax. Must Rice Admit Black Stoods? Stoods is a term that in the 1920s Rice students would use to refer to themselves sometimes, stoods. So must Rice admit black stoods is the question that the Pre-Law Society took up at that banquet in 1928. And at that meeting, a member of the society read a letter that he indicated had come from the faculty and the trustees. And what that letter said was, in this age of equality, is it now time for Rice to admit black students? And the letter indicated that they wanted to hear from the Pre-Law Society because they had a great deal of respect for their debating abilities to answer the question with a yes or a no. And many answered, some profanely, in exactly the way that one might expect students at Rice University to answer this question in Houston, Texas in 1928. Rice, of course, was an all-white school in 1928. And so the answer that came from most of the students will not surprise you. But not all students answered in this way. One student responded, I think it the normal thing to do in this free land of equality. And when he said as much, the response was swift and full of explosives and harassing retorts. And the temperature in the room increased, and the whole place became a seething, perspiring mess, according to the Thresher. Joe Garza, the paper says, also spoke in favor of equality before he was hooted to yield the floor. An additional student also spoke in favor of the proposition. Yes, we should admit black students to rights here in 1928. But before he got to the end of his remarks, he faltered a bit. So it actually isn't clear from the article whether he was answering the question in the affirmative or in the negative. Now, the dinner that night, the Thresher tells us, was served by a group of African-American waiters. So now I want you to imagine this scene a little differently than perhaps you have up until this point. A group of white, as far as we can tell, all male students addressing this question aggressively, somewhat violently in instances. And the whole time swirling about them were a group of African-American waiters who aren't portrayed sympathetically in the Rice Thresher article. We shouldn't be surprised at that. But all we really need to know is that they were there and listening and thinking, and I'm certain judging the affair closely and critically, taking a measure of these students. Now, when it was all said and done, a vote was taken of the society, all the ones who were there that evening. And now my question to you is, how many folks do you think voted in favor of that proposition? There are about 20 students in the pre-law society at the banquet that night. So out of 20 votes, how many said, yeah, I think in this land of equality, in this age of equality, as the letter put it, Rice should admit black students? I think half, maybe? Perhaps somewhat less? Go ahead and write it down, maybe. A few of you I know are thinking none. Not a single one. I'm curious too on what the number you're thinking. I'm curious about, if you were to analyze that number, what would you make of it? What would it mean if half of the 20 voted yes? What would it mean for the kind of place that Rice was? What would it mean if it was 8 students who voted yes, or 2? What might it mean if none voted? Not a single student voted yes, even after arguing positively for the proposition. And now an altogether different question for you to consider. If the vote was taken among the black waiters at the banquet, what do you think it would have been? Well, as recorded in the Thresher, the vote was 14 against the proposition. No, black students shouldn't be admitted to Rice. And 5 in favor. 5 students in the pre-law society in 1928 said, yeah, black students should be at Rice. And I think this says something about universities, that 5. I think it may say something about Rice. And I'm certain it says something about people in general. And now is the point I think that I want to make with all of this. As you enter the university, there are questions around equity and inclusion that are as big as the question that was asked of the Law Society in 1928. Engage those questions. Engage the questions of your day with courage, and with a commitment to thinking through them. Because at universities, even at Rice in 1928, when almost everyone at a place can be wrong, it's never the case that everyone is wrong. In 1928, at Rice University, at an all-white institution, in the heart of the Jim Crow South, there were people who could imagine. Did I say people? There were students. Students are people. But I think it's important to say that to indicate that these folks were students. In 1928, at Rice University, in a segregated city, at a segregated university, there were students who could imagine a more inclusive and equitable and diverse place. Even if the president of the university, even if the board and a great deal of the faculty and the student body did not have that imagination or courage of, say, a Joe Garza. Joe Garza did. Joe Garza and a few others had that imagination and that courage. And so did a few others. Could you have been Joe Garza? I asked myself that. Could I have been Joe Garza? We don't spend a lot of time with this, but this is from the Thresher in 1987. It has Steve McVeigh on the cover, and he's a former president of the Rice BSA, and he's arguing for the opening of an Office of Minority Affairs. And the reason he's making this argument in 1987 is because black folks and Latinx folks had been at the university for a not insignificant period of time. But there were ways in which they did not feel welcome. And he thought that the institution needed a greater amount of institutional commitment to opening up the university to this more diverse student body. And in 1987, he's arguing in this piece against folks who made the case that opening up an Office of Minority Affairs would actually alienate minority students. And McVeigh is arguing against this. And an Office of Minority Affairs is actually opened later in that school year. Again, not the least because of efforts by students like Steve McVeigh. And we've come a long way since 1987, and it's indicative of more than a notion that the pictures that I'm showing you now aren't in black and white, but they're in full color, and that we have an Office of Multicultural Affairs at Rice that is as vibrant as this webpage here indicates. It's also not for nothing that we have at this university now a Department of Transnational Asian Studies. And a Center for Transnational Asian Studies. Ideas that could not have been imagined as key and central parts of the university in the 1920s and 1930s and 40s that are now fundamental parts of the education that we provide at this university. If you go to any of the pages of your residential colleges, you will find splashed across them measures of support like Stop Asian Hate and Black Lives Matter. These are indications of the development and maturation of the residential college system that I think students in the mid-1980s would have had trouble imagining. And you have arrived at this university at a phenomenal moment, at a moment when there is a center for the study of women, gender, and sexuality at the university. When if I call up the front page of the Department of Sociology, the first 3 lines of the faculty look like this. It's kind of amazing. If you go to the board of directors of the Association of Rice Alumni and look at the first 2 lines of the people who represent the entire alumni of Rice University, it looks like this. And you've arrived at the university at a time when it has a student body that is as diverse as it has ever been. And the question now for us is, what kind of university are we to become now that we are amongst the most diverse institutions of any kind in the country? What is possible for us now? Where will you lead us next? In 1928, Joe Garza was hooted to his seat for imagining a different Rice. I don't think that will happen to you now. It might, but I don't think it will. If you're bold in your imagination for what you want and desire out of this university and making it an even more equitable and inclusive place. But if you are, I hope that you'll remember Garza, and you ask yourself the question whether he arrived at Rice with the courage and imagination that he demonstrated in 1928. Or whether he found it here. Here's a dream that I have. I think, this shows I'm somewhat of an optimist. I think if the vote was taken again from the pre-law society 3 days after its November banquet, I think the vote very well could have been 12-7 3 days later. And that's why I think it's important for you to be like the five when it comes to addressing the difficult and hard questions of our day around equality and equity. The slide I'm showing you now is of Catherine Clack. And you're about to hear from her next. And it's she was the director, the first director of the Office of Minority Affairs. When black students and faculty imagined a greater institutional commitment to what were then thought of as minority students at the university. The woman you're about to hear next filled that office. And she has filled it since its founding and through its several iterations. And the growth of that office here is just representative of the growth of many offices and institutions like it at the university. You're going to learn a lot from her next, and you're going to learn a lot from folks like her here at Rice. And even more importantly, we're going to learn a great, great deal from you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Byrd, for your beautiful presentation on the history of diversity and inclusion at Rice and the role anyone can have in being a change agent at Rice University. Hi, I'm Catherine Clack, Associate Dean of Undergraduates and Director of the Office of Multicultural Affairs, where part of my responsibility is to help build and maintain a supportive and inclusive community at Rice. Diversity and inclusion are paramount here. Please allow me to take just a few minutes to continue Dr. Byrd's thread of thought by talking about our beloved community of today in its truest sense, and why diversity and inclusion and pride in our community includes and impacts each and every one of you in terms of the choices you will make. True inclusion requires commitment, time, and the dedication of all members of our campus. So I'd like to take some time to talk about your role in helping Rice University be a truly inclusive university. I realize it is very easy to think of diversity and inclusion as being a problem or concern of others, other people, other groups. If it doesn't affect me directly, I'm not going to think about it. But diversity touches all of us in some way, and diversity and inclusion is actually at the heart of who we are at Rice. And as your time here will show, While we are not perfect by any means, as a community, we are dedicated and determined to keep diversity and inclusion a top priority. So, what does this mean for you? First off, it requires each of us to acknowledge that we are members of a true community. You may already be feeling that with your residential colleges. You know that already that it's your home base, that it's your team, that you are linked to your community and your college. 20 years from now, you're going to be walking down the street and hear across the road, Jeeba! And know that your community is there. You'll be in a crowded room and somebody will yell, Team Weiss! And you will find your community again. And I'm sure you're hearing a lot about the culture of care. Our culture of care reminds you that all of Rice is your community, your home base, and that as a community, we have an obligation to look out for and respect each other, to encourage, support, and nurture each other, to strive to make real and genuine personal connections with each other. And Rice is the ideal place for those connections. Now, the diversity facilitators, who are your peers, will be leading a workshop for you later, and it's our hope that they are able to reinforce not only our unique culture of care, but get you started on the road to realizing that the lenses through which you see the world may be affecting your decisions about how, and maybe even if, you associate with diverse members of our community. As I said before, I wanted to talk about the choices we make in relation to diversity inclusion. We are all very aware that not everyone comes to Rice prepared to embrace diversity that we cherish. Others want to embrace it, but just don't know where to start. We don't assume that you all came from a richly diverse high school or neighborhood where living in a diverse community and exploring different cultures and customs is the norm. So we acknowledge that mistakes in our interactions with each other will be made. Heck, I've been in the Office of Multicultural Affairs since 1988. Don't gasp, you guys. 1988, and I still make mistakes. But at Rice, you will be allowed to make those unintentional mistakes so long as you are genuine and respectful in learning from them. As a community, we collectively aim to educate, not diminish. Intentional harm, however, can, of course, come with some serious consequences. So again, it's about the choices you make. Your diversity facilitators, or DFs as we like to call them, will help you learn to talk about diversity inclusion so that you can make those authentic, valuable, and lasting connections with your diverse classmates. You'll be attending an O-Week workshop specifically focused on some of the missteps that can occur in terms of diversity and inclusion, with a critical eye towards maintaining both our community and your relationships. As a result, your DS will guide you through a workshop that addresses microaggressions, what they are, why they are the most pervasive diversity problem we have on campus. I'm going to give you a hint. Microaggressions are those everyday unintentional slights that convey bigotry or bias, but microaggressions are typically not intentional, despite what they communicate. And then we want you to know how to respond to them. Don't worry, you'll walk away from the O-Week workshop thinking, I get it now. They will ask you to examine the issue of privilege, how it affects us and our worldview, and then encourage you to use your privilege, which each and every one of us have in some way, to better Rice for others, to stand up for the marginalized or the oppressed, or even just to use your creative juices and energies to interact and enact change. The DFs will then go one step further, encourage you to be an ally to those who have been marginalized or oppressed. Again, a decision you get to make as you begin to decide the kind of person you want to be. Rice continually strives for excellence in all things, and fundamental to that change is clear empirical data that diversity and inclusion must be both achieved, valued, and maintained in all areas of our community. This means we will continue to create and prioritize diversity and inclusion in order to not only markedly enrich your education and experience, but to better prepare you to be both globally and culturally aware, skills that are going to be critical for your future success. This also means, however, that once again you must choose to take advantage of those opportunities. Don't hang out with just the same people you hung out with in high school. Ensure your circle of friends is diverse and be conscientious about making that a priority. Don't automatically avoid those who don't share your background, who don't eat the same foods, who don't speak the same language, share the same religion. Making comfortable, respectful connections across all aspects of identity and allowing yourself to truly respect and appreciate all aspects of identity is crucial in maintaining our beloved community. Learn from the O-Week workshops with your highly trained team of diversity facilitators. Ask them the hard questions you've always wanted to ask. Share struggles you may be experiencing between the way you were reared and what you're coming to know. Learn to embrace what's known as cognitive dissonance, where your previously held feelings, ideas, beliefs, or actions are confronted with new and contradictory information. Think about that for a second. You're being confronted with new and contradictory information. Yeah, cognitive dissonance can be uncomfortable, but it's just your brain working to make sense of this new evidence, experience, or information that is in conflict with your previously held beliefs. Let me give you an example. Let's say you were raised in a traditional and conservative, patriarchal household where women were not valued as much as men, and your community provided very few indicators that there was a different way of viewing gender differences. Now, upon coming to Rice, you perhaps came with assumptions about men being better than women in certain academic fields. How might you then respond when a female peer asks to join your study group, or you are assigned a number of women on your team to finish an important engineering project? Cognitive dissonance may ensue, but as a young adult, you get to actually choose how to address it and which of your previously held values, beliefs, and ideals you truly want to hold on to. So do yourself a favor and don't sell yourself short, not realizing that some of the women in your group are at the top of the class. Are you going to learn from the experience of cognitive dissonance and evolve? Are you going to change? Are you going to alter your beliefs or your value systems? This is just one example, but I hope you get the idea. Perhaps the lens through which you view the world is also creating what we call blind spots. Those blind spots are biases, and we all have them. Unconscious bias influences our decisions and behavior in ways so subtle that they can completely escape our notice. And while we cannot completely get rid of those unconscious biases, they are, after all, unconscious. That is not an excuse for not respecting diversity or not trying to tackle those biases when we become aware of them. It is because of those biases, though, that we then create unintended messages or actions that can tend to exclude others. Exclude, contrary to inclusion. So we want to challenge perhaps your view of diversity, how it's part of your world, whether or not you acknowledge or recognize it, and more importantly, how it is necessary for all of us to be part of the process of valuing diversity. It's about accepting responsibility for your role in creating and sustaining a community that is more inclusive and equitable in its treatment of racial and ethnic minorities, women, the differently abled, your LGBTQ peers, and it is central to the mission of this great university. We believe open dialogue to discuss and work through differences in beliefs and values are essential to the operation of a democratic society and to maintaining a healthy environment at Rice. Of course, it's easier for some of us to avoid talking about or even thinking about racism, sexism, or homophobia, for instance, than to enter into a challenging dialogue on those topics. And there is great privilege in the ability to do that. You make mistakes, but that's okay. Just learn from them. Let's move beyond these barriers because these conversations should very much be a part of your growth, your development, and your college experience. And this is the place, this beautiful microcosm of the world that is Rice University. During O Week even, you can look around and witness the beautiful tapestry of races, ethnicities, gender identities, religions, abilities that make up your class. What an incredible community for growth and development. Take the time to reflect. Reflection is an important part of any anti-racist toolkit because it involves being able to take a critical look at your own experiences, beliefs, and behaviors, and it has to start there. It's not easy work, but the effort matters. So I encourage you to embrace our community of care and our commitment to diversity by rightly looking out for and standing up for each other. When you see a wrong, find the courage to stand up and confront that wrong. Learn to do so respectfully so our valued community can stay strong. Don't let racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, or hate of any kind take root on our campus. Choose to take advantage of the wealth of opportunities for you to engage with those who can introduce you to something different, to attend lectures, showcases, dinners, events that highlight the many different, vibrant cultural communities at Rice. With an open mind and an open heart, make the choice to increase your cultural knowledge and commit to lovingly exploring and learning about others while you willingly show yourself. Let me end by echoing Dr. Byrd's profound question. Where will you help lead the university? What kind of impact will you have during your time here? What kind of legacy might you leave behind? How do you want to remember Rice? And how do you want Rice to remember you? Be the change, my friends, because we got you. And please allow me to add my personal welcome to Rice. You have chosen well, my young Padawans, as this is a vibrant, living, transformative community to which you have chosen to join, and we are so excited to have you here. Thank you again for your time, and once again, welcome to our beloved community.